I always hesitate to refer to myself as having an expertise here. I don't know that I've done my 10,000 hours, but just so that you do know of the informed opinion I'm coming with, I've made 14 trips to Israel and Palestine over the last 23 years. I have a bachelor's in history. I studied specifically the rise of Zionism and the development of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I have a master's in conflict resolution and reconciliation. I have 2 books out dealing with the conflict. One's called I Am Not Your Enemy, and one is called Letters from Apartheid Street. I've been lecturing in universities about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for several years. I teach these kind of 101 courses, multi-week courses for organizations and churches, and I am well read extensively on the history and to a degree the current events. So again, not heralding myself as an expert, but I do want you to have confidence that what you hear is from a very informed and experienced perspective. Other things, yeah, just to also acknowledge, you will undoubtedly, especially if you're in any way familiar with the history of this place, you're undoubtedly going to be to listen to this and think, oh, he left out some stuff. 100%, because we have 60 minutes to cover 115 years. All of history is reductionist in a way, right? The only accurate map is one that is literally the size of the thing it represents. We cannot see and tell, we cannot hear and tell every story. So I'm giving you the ones that I think are essential to understand. But just know that it is by definition reductionist. There's always more to go through. Finally, when you signed up for this, it automatically added you to my email list so that I could send you automated emails. If you don't want to be on my email list, just hit unsubscribe at the bottom of any email that you get from me. Okay, I already see questions coming in the chat. Fantastic. I will not, as we go, unless Dad sees something he thinks, unless there's a question of clarity around something I've just said, Dad, flag that if you see it. Otherwise, I'm not stopping for questions until I have run through the material. And then I will respond to the questions that are in the chat. We now have 157 on here. Thank you all so much for coming. I really hope that this is helpful to understanding the current crisis that's unfolding. Okay, let us begin with some terms. So a few things to understand just in terms of some basic terminology. Zionist, the term Zionist does not equal Israeli, and Israeli does not equal Jew, and Zionist does not equal Jew. They're all different terms. This is very shorthand. So again, we're covering a lot of ground as we go. Zionist more or less refers to someone who believes that Israel has a right to exist in the historic land of Palestine. There is a spectrum of that from people that believe that Israel should exist alongside Palestinian neighbors, and they would claim to be Zionists. And there are other Zionists who would say Israel should exist and nobody else should exist in that land. But Zionism, if you're a Zionist, then you would believe that Israel has a right to exist in the land that it exists on currently. So that's Zionist. Israeli is simply a national term. You're an Israeli if you're a citizen of Israel. Now, it's important to note also that currently 20% of the Israeli population are not Jews. 20% are Palestinian Arabs. So being an Israeli does not mean that you are Jewish. So 20% of Israel's population are not Jewish. And you can be a Jew, obviously, and not be an Israeli and live in Israel, or be a Zionist. So a Jew is an ethnic and religious term. So just to know the distinctions between these, we cannot use them interchangeably because they don't all mean the same thing. Then you have Arab, does not equal Palestinian, does not equal Muslim. Arab, there are Arab peoples all over the Middle East and all over the world. Palestinian is a national term referring to Arabs primarily. The official definition of Palestinian are that they are Arabic people, and they are Arabs that have lived that lived in Palestine before 1947, or the descendants of the people that have lived there. So it's a claim to a specific place. And so you'll often hear people that want to delegitimize Palestinian claims to the land will simply refer to them as Arabs, making the argument that if they're Arabs, they can go anywhere other Arabs can go. And so Palestinian is to refer to Arabs of a specific place, that being Palestine. And not all Palestinians are Muslims. The majority of them are. There is a Christian population. There are other populations, but primarily in terms of religion, it's mostly Muslim, with a small population being Christian. The Christian population used to be much higher, but due to the occupation and conflict, it has diminished. So I hope that's helpful to just begin by getting a bit of terminology about some of the things you're going to hear today. At the beginning, let's talk about a quick myth. One myth about this place is that Jews and Arabs have been fighting forever. This is not true. The conflict itself is about 100 years old. Have Jewish people ever fought with Arab people before? Of course, like people fight all over the world. But in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the conflict over this place, it is not from time immemorial. It is a modern conflict. So let's start with that, dispelling that myth. Another one, this myth is a conflict over religion. This is false. Do people bring in religious, do they inject their religion into the conflict? Yes, this happens all over the world. Religion can become another easy marker to distinguish who's in your camp and who's not. But this is not a conflict over religion. I would say it is a conflict over land, over identity, over where to call home, and then now, of course, over historical grievance. You killed my people, you killed my people, I have to get even. But this is a conflict over who has control of the land, which identity has sovereignty over the land, who gets to call this place their home, and what to do about all the trauma that's happened. By the way, I'm hearing some background noise. Please make sure you are muted so that we're not getting that background noise. Dad, if you can also monitor that, that would be great. Let's take a look at geography. This is the Middle East, broader Middle East. Israel and Palestine, are right here. So it's a very small piece of land surrounded immediately by Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And then kind of this outer circle would be Turkey, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and Cyprus in the sea. So just to get us oriented to where we are in the world. And when we talk specifically about Israel and Palestine, we're talking about this piece of land here. What you see in white and gray is what is referred to as the state of Israel. What you see in green is what is referred to as Palestine. That includes the West Bank here and the Gaza Strip here, which is what you're hearing about in the news right now. For context about the size of Gaza specifically, because we're hearing so much about this, Gaza is incredibly small. It is 25 miles long and 7 miles wide. So I just invite you right now to think of a place that you go to frequently that is about 25 miles from you. That might be on the other side of the city that you live in. Like Nashville is bigger than 25 miles wide. Or it might be another town if you're in a more rural area, for instance. The distance from where you are to that place, 25 miles, is the length of the entire Gaza Strip. So it is not a big piece of land. When you're hearing the struggle people are having in terms of moving and evacuating, it's because they're moving within a very confined space. So it's an incredibly small piece of real estate that we are talking about. Okay, so this is just to get clear, Israel is not referring to all of the land. It's referring to what you see in white and gray. Palestine, unless we're talking about it historically, in terms of before the establishment of the state of Israel, is just referring to what's in green, and that's the West Bank and Gaza. There are 5 key issues that most peace negotiations have been working to solve, and they're called the final status issues. Those are what to do with all of the Palestinian refugees. Until recently, Palestinian refugees and their descendants were the largest refugee population in the world. So there's a big issue for Palestinians about what they claim is the right of return. Refugees and Palestinian refugees should have the right to return to their homeland. So this is a big issue. The issue of settlements. These are Israeli towns and cities that are built on Palestinian land. We'll get to this. We'll get to all this in the story. What to do about the issue of settlements that are on Palestinian land but are Israeli. Where are the actual borders? If there's a 2-state solution, where are the borders of Israel and where are the borders of the West Bank? Israel has never officially declared where its borders are. Who has control of water and essential resources? And what do we do about Jerusalem? There are competing claims about what happens with Jerusalem. These are the big issues that have to be resolved for there to be any kind of agreed upon settlement, peace settlement. So I'm going to walk you through these. I'll remind you as we go through the story when we're hitting one of these final status issues. So let's dive into the story. Where I'm going to start the story is in 1896 in Europe. Now, you may be thinking, my goodness, that's much more recent than I thought you were going to start the story, which is what I was telling you. This is a very recent conflict. The context for this, where we're starting here, is that Jewish people there was a Jewish diaspora, meaning the spreading out of Jews from historic Palestine, that had been going on at this point for about 1700 years, ever since 70 AD, when the Romans drove most of the Jewish people from the land. Since that time, there has been a longing among Jewish people to return. There are often prayers that say next year in Jerusalem, to go back to Palestine, to go back to their homeland, to what they would call the Promised Land. In 1896, this man, Theodor Herzl, takes what has been a centuries-old longing and tries to put legs to it, to turn it into an actual political, tangible, practical movement. There has been a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe at this point. There have been pogroms, direct kind of targeted persecution of Jews, especially in Western Russia and Eastern Europe. There's a rise of anti-Semitism in France, where Herzl is, and he basically decides, I've had enough. Jews are never going to be welcome in places where there are other Jews. And so Herzl decides, I'm going to write the manifesto for how all this is going to happen. And so he publishes a book called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State. This is in 1896. And it articulates very clearly how this achievement of a Jewish homeland would be realized. He puts the language, what the language should be, what the flag should look like, including where it should be. He actually proposes Palestine or Argentina, little known fact. It was not guaranteed that the Jewish state would be in Palestine. The very next year, in 1897, 200 delegates, Jewish delegates, convene in Basel, Switzerland, and they form what's called the World Zionist Congress. And they basically discuss what Herzl has said, and they say, what do we think about this? They say, yes, we must make this happen. It's time for us to actually achieve our dream of having a homeland back, our Jewish national home back in Palestine. And they confirm that it will, in fact, be Palestine. It will not be Argentina. And so this is where Zionism, this term Zionism, really begins to emerge. There was the Zionist longing for a home, for safety and security, a return to Palestine for centuries. But where it becomes a tangible, practical, legs on it movement, this happens in the late 1800s. There have been these persecutions that have driven many Jewish people to immigrate to Palestine. It's called an aliyah. That's the word that means the ascent. The technical translation is ascent in Hebrew, but it means mass immigration to Palestine, or today Israel. During this time, as the World Zionist Congress has decided we're going forward, we're going to make this happen, a writer named Israel Zangwill begins to, he's a British writer, he begins to put out a phrase that really catches like wildfire. That phrase is this: Palestine is a land without a people for a people without a land. I'm sure many of you have heard this statement before. It is a well-known one, and I believe it took great hold among most of the immigrants that were moving to Palestine. This idea that here we are, people with no place to call home, nowhere that we're safe, and Palestine is empty. It is our ancestral homeland. It's waiting for us. This is a match made in heaven. And this drives many people to immigrate to Palestine in order to achieve this. Now, the complication in the story is that this wasn't true. And at the leadership level of the Zionist movement, they knew this. That they, and I'll just show you some statistics here about what Palestine, the current population of Palestine, or the population of Palestine at that time. Israel and Palestine is about 10,000 square miles, which is about the size of Maryland or Vermont. The Negev Desert, which is down here, is mostly uninhabitable. There are groups that live there, but not very many. And so the actual inhabitable part of the land is the size of Connecticut, or a little bit smaller. So it's a very, very small piece of real estate that we're talking about here. The official census at the time that the Jewish state, Herzl's writing, was published, the Ottomans were in control of the land, and they said there were about 450,000 Muslims and Christians and 15,000 Jews. The land was absolutely not empty. The British census in 1922, Britain takes over later. You can see those numbers there as well. And so it was a powerful galvanizing sentiment that Palestine is a land without a people for a people without a land, but it was a false one. But the propaganda definitely was effective. And so the question then became, as people began to realize that this statement was actually not true, that there was a complication, that the land that they wanted to go to had people on it, then the question became, how do we create a Jewish homeland in a land with other people? Now, I want to say that though I have, and many people have, great issue with the way in which this story unfolds, and the way in which the Zionist dream gets implemented, it is not hard for me to understand the dream itself. If you take a people that have been persecuted in various places for centuries, and who are seeing that anytime they are around people that are not Jews, they struggle with assimilation, there's targeted persecution, there are killings. It would not take much to begin to think what we need is a place where it's only us. That's what it's going to take for us to be safe and secure. I understand, like I can get my head and my heart around that longing. So I have deep empathy for the Zionist dream. What is complicated and where the challenge comes in is the way in which it actually manifests. So as they are talking about this question of how do we create a Jewish homeland in a land with other people, Theodor Herzl writes this in his diary: "We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border of Palestine into Jordan, by procuring employment for them in transit countries while denying any employment in our own country. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." In other words, we're going to make the local indigenous people leave through employment, through labor. We're going to make it hard for them to have jobs in Palestine and make it easy for them to have jobs elsewhere. So it was an economic dispossession, was the dream that Herzl had soon after the writing of the Jewish state. The early 1900s come around, and there's another major wave of persecution in Europe, and so a second wave of Jewish immigrants. These are primarily socialists that are coming, intending to set up agricultural settlements in the land. And they come with two major ideas. One is called the conquest of land, and the other is called the conquest of labor. The idea here is that these immigrants believed that the way to achieve what they wanted to with a Jewish homeland was to colonize and cultivate as much of the land as possible, to buy up as much of the land as possible. And at this time, there's an organization formed called the Jewish National Fund that passes that has a law built into it that says any land the Jewish National Fund purchases can only stay Jewish. It is illegal for it to be sold to anyone who is not a Jew. And so the Jewish National Fund begins buying up lots of land, from Arabs, others from Ottoman absentee landowners. And at this point, what happens is that many of these pieces of land that are bought up, Arab workers had been working there on the farms, and they are now denied that labor. This is where there's a huge shift into having Jewish-only labor on the land, which is what Herzl had described, right? So there's a degree to which it's implementing much of what Herzl had talked about. And so we have the conquest of land, the colonization of the land, and the conquest of labor to get as many, take as many of the work opportunities as possible and put them in the hands of Jews only. I would make the case that this is the moment where what we call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really begins, because this is where the unrest begins to significantly increase, which should not be surprising for Arabs, seeing the work opportunities disappearing, seeing their land being continually bought up by immigrants. And so there's rising unrest and the beginning of violent clashes between the Jewish immigrants and the local Arabs. We then get to the period of World War I, 1914. The Middle East is kind of on the brink of collapse in many ways during this war. The Ottoman Empire is falling apart. They have been in control of Palestine since about 1517, I think it is. They hold on to it for 400 years until approximately 1917. During World War I, Ottoman Empire collapses, and the Middle East gets divided up. The French take a whole bunch of it, and Britain takes a whole bunch of it. One of the pieces that Britain takes is Palestine. They called it the British Mandate of Palestine. So you'll hear this term every once in a while. The term is mandatory Palestine. That just refers to the whole of the land that was under the control of Britain. So Britain takes control of Palestine. And during this period of World War I, there's a dynamic shift that happens, is that as Britain is knowing that it's about to take over, the British Foreign Secretary sends a telegram to a prominent Jewish leader in England named Lord Rothschild. And here's what he says: "The British government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities. This is known as the Balfour Declaration. If you read anything about Israel, Palestine, and its history, this will come up, because this is where now a major power, world power, is throwing its weight behind one of the sides, so to speak. And so it's now increasing the polarization between the Jews that live in Palestine and the Arabs that live in Palestine. And the Arabs, of course, the Zionists are very excited by this, to have the backing of the British government. The Arabs are not. To see this intervention from Britain is deeply distressing to the local Arabs. Over the next years, tensions continue to rise until there are a series of clashes in 1929 over basically who would control the Western Wall. The Western Wall was in control of Arabs at that time, but they were beginning to sense that there was about to be a Zionist attempt to take over the Western Wall and the Temple Mount. And so they begin to have clashes over Jerusalem. And this is the most violence that has happened at this point in the conflict. I can't remember the exact numbers. I think by the end of this, there's approximately 100 Palestinians who have died, and I think around the same for Jewish people. In particular, in the city of Hebron, in the south of the West Bank, 67 Jews were killed in one community. And so this again is another point where there's an even deeper fracture that is happening as the sides are becoming clear of it's Jew versus Arab, because this is the distinction that's being drawn in the violence of who's on our side and who's not. So the 1929 clashes increase this division and begin to fuel the perpetuation of the conflict. Things get so bad in this conflict that Britain says we've got to do something. This is not sustainable. We need to find a way for there to be a Jewish state and an Arab state. And so this is the first that I'm aware of proposed partition of historic Palestine into a Jewish state, which you see in the yellow, and an Arab state, which you see in the red. And then the green is what was meant to stay under the control of Britain. And this is a path. Let me see if I can zoom in. Yeah, this is a path to the sea from Jerusalem and Bethlehem to Tel Aviv and Jaffa. So this was the proposal. It did not go well. Neither group were in big favor of this. You might ask yourself, why was there such a small kind of piece of land? How did they decide how to divide this up in this way? Well, it was based on where the populations were residing. This map, in green and blue, you see where the Jewish communities of Palestine were located. They were located in the fertile areas of the north, where the Sea of Galilee is, Nazareth, these areas. That's where wine is grown. It's very green, and the fertile areas and sea access of the coast. And so you can see that many of the early Jewish immigrants were not actually deeply religious. Many of them were socialist, many of them were secular. And so there's not at this time a large presence here in the heart of the promised land, Judea and Samaria. There's not a lot of groups going there. They're staying where they can make a good life for themselves by the sea and in the fertile areas of the north. And so that's how Britain decides to divide up land, is based on that. David Ben-Gurion, he's a leader, a growing leader. He's the head of the Jewish Agency at this time. He ends up becoming the first prime minister of Israel. This is what he says after the partition the proposed partition is announced. He says a Jewish state must be established immediately, even if it is only in part of the country. The rest will follow in the course of time. A Jewish state will come. He goes on, I think I have another one. He goes on to say, of course, the partition of the country gives us no pleasure, but the country they are partitioning is not in our actual possession. It is in the possession of the Arabs and the English. What is in our actual possession is less than what they are proposing for a Jewish state. In other words, this is an opportunity. If I were an Arab, I would have been very indignant, he says. My assumption is that a Jewish state on only part of the land is not the end, but the beginning. So there were many on the extreme side of the Zionist movement that absolutely rejected the partition, because they said we will settle for nothing less than the whole of Palestine. And then there were others like Ben-Gurion who had a different strategy, who said, let's take what is here, we'll use it as a foothold, and then we will be able from that place to expand over time and to take the rest of the land. after this proposal is withdrawn, Britain says, you know what, they called it impracticable. I love that word. It's impracticable to create a Jewish state and an Arab state within the same land. This is what they thought in 1937. And so they issue a document called the White Paper of 1939. It's a new British policy that tried to appease many of the Arab grievances. And so it put in restrictions to control Jewish immigration, which was increasing because, as you know, 1939 is the start of World War II. So it's aiming to control Jewish immigration and restrict the amount of land that the Jewish National Fund is able to purchase. And it intended to limit Jewish population to only 1/3 of the total population. It would not let it grow beyond that. Obviously, the Zionist leaders said, absolutely not. We are rejecting this wholeheartedly because it controlled their immigration, it restricted the amount of land they could purchase, and it would not allow them to fulfill the dream that they had. Arabs also rejected it because it resulted in still more Arab loss of land, and it did not guarantee an Arab state in Palestine. And so both groups reject this. And then the Zionist movement changes its tactics, whereas it had been benefiting from the sponsorship of Britain, right? The Balfour Declaration got Britain behind the Zionist movement. Now the Zionists changed tactics, and their response is three-pronged. One, they begin illegally immigrating into Palestine. If you've ever seen the movie Exodus, by the way, with Paul Newman, this is part of the story there of trying to sneak in on boats and making their way in because it was forbidden at that time. There were restrictions on it from the British. They also decide to switch their imperial sponsors. Britain, you served your purpose. We're done with you. Off we go to the U.S. And so they bring the U.S. in on their side. And you can see what a fantastic strategic decision that was because the U.S. has stayed deeply loyal. And even President Biden this week saying we unequivocally support Israel. We have their back forever. No questions asked. This is the policy of the United States for most of the history. So it was a very wise and strategic move from the Zionist leadership. And they also then begin sabotaging, bombing, and assassinating the British. So it's very interesting because we have a sense, I would guess that many of you do, that when you think of terrorism in Israel and Palestine, you think of Palestinians because in most of our lifetimes, that's what has happened. But the actual early expressions of terrorism were actually not Palestinians. They were the Zionist movement targeting the British. In fact, one of the most famous examples of this is the bombing of the King David Hotel, which again in the movie Exodus you might have seen. This is where many of the British officers were stationed, and so they blew up the Zionist paramilitaries blew up a wing of this hotel, killed 88 people. And here's a quote from Yitzhak Shamir, who was the leader of the Irgun at the time, which was one of the primary paramilitary groups of the Zionist movement. He ends up becoming a prime minister of Israel. He says, neither Jewish ethics nor Jewish tradition can disqualify terrorism as a means of combat. First and foremost, terrorism is for us part of the political battle being conducted under our present circumstances, and it has a great part to play in our war against the occupier. And so this is what he's articulating here is also what many Palestinians have articulated in the expression of terrorism from their side of this is part of the war against occupation. It's what the Jewish immigrants movement did against the British, and it's what Palestinians have done against Israel. And so there's commonality in terms of this expression of resistance when you perceive someone as controlling land that you claim is yours. We then enter the period of the Holocaust. I won't spend a lot of time here, not because it's not important. Of course it is, because we know this story. We've studied it. We've seen the movies. We've been to the museums. We're very familiar with this story. But as a reminder, of course, 6 million Jewish people are killed throughout Europe during the Holocaust. In Poland alone, if I'm not mistaken, there were 3.3. I think this is right, 3.3 million Jews in Poland. By the end, there were about 300,000. Or is either that or is it 300,000 and there were 30,000 left? I can't remember the exact numbers, but there was a massive decrease in the Jewish population of Poland. And so we cannot overemphasize the absolute devastation, both in terms of that present moment and the historical trauma that has been passed through the generations of what happened at that time. And it's important to note that what happened on October 7th with the Hamas attack on Israel was, for Jewish people, the deadliest single day since the Holocaust. More Jews died on October 7th than have died in a single day since the Holocaust. And so you can begin to get your heart and your mind hopefully around the horror and the trauma that Israel and the Israeli people are also feeling, and many Jews around the world. One of my Israeli friends texted and said, it feels like the Holocaust all over again. That was the emotional reality of what they experienced on October 7th. We'll get to Palestinian experience soon. What happens here is that Jewish immigration to Palestine skyrockets as the genocide is happening in Europe. As many people as can get out, try to leave. Many go to the US, which doesn't work out well. The US sends most of them back to Europe to die. And many make it to Palestine, trying to get through the restrictions of the British. And so Jewish immigration massively increases at this time. In light of this, as Jewish refugees and immigrants are flooding into Palestine, Britain has had enough. And it says, we don't know how to solve this problem. And so in February of 47, they give the problem to the United Nations. And they say, look, we're pulling out in about next year. You need to figure out what to do with this. And so in November of 1947, the UN drafts a resolution called 181, which proposed a new partition for Palestine. Again, you can see in the light colored would be the Jewish state, very similar to the British proposal, but with the Negev as well. And in the dark color, you see what would be the Arab state, which again, Jerusalem here would be carved out as an international territory. Neither the Jewish state nor the Arab state would have control of Jerusalem. This goes through. 33 votes yes, including the United States, 13 no, all of the Arab states say no, and 10 abstained, including Great Britain, which I always just find very funny that I feel like Great Britain was so done with the place that they're like, we're not even going to vote on it. We're absolutely out of here. And so the resolution passes with, again, mixed responses from the Zionist movement. The primary leadership, David Ben-Gurion and others, accept this. Others on the extreme say this is not enough. We need the whole of the land. Palestinian Arabs made up primarily of what's called the AHC, it's the Arab High Council. They say no. And the reason why they say no, and the reason why the Zionists say yes, is because this proposal, take a look here, gave over half of the land of Palestine, 55%, to the minority population. Jews at that time were 37% of the population, but they got overnight 55% of the land. And not only were they 37% of the population, but they only controlled approximately or owned 7% of the land. And so overnight, the Arabs that lived in this light color became a minority in a place where they were, 63% of majority. So there were, within the Jewish state after the partition, there were 500,000 Jews and approximately 400,000 Arabs. So this is, again, why the Zionists say yes? Well, because they had a fantastic deal that was presented. You're a minority population, only 7% of the land, and here you are being presented with 55. For the Arabs, they're saying, we were living here, immigrants came in, Britain's intervened, the UN has intervened, and we somehow continue to lose access and control of the land. So this is the story that's beginning to play out. Again, to go back to David Ben-Gurion, he says, this is what he said after the British partition in 1937. After we constitute a large force following the establishment of the Jewish state, we will cancel the partition and we will expand throughout the land of Israel. And so again, there's an idea within the higher levels of the Zionist leadership that this partition is only the beginning. We will abolish this and we will expand. And this is part of what happens next. So on May 14th, 1948, Britain leaves and the Zionists declare the establishment of the state of Israel. So now we can talk about Israelis. We couldn't talk about Israelis until now. Now there's a state of Israel, May 14th, 1948. David Ben-Gurion is the first prime minister. The US and the Soviet Union are very quick to recognize it, already beginning a little Cold War dynamic. The very next day, the surrounding Arab nations attack Israel, and Israel begins its war of independence. So that's how Israel would talk about this period. It was the war of independence, fighting for survival. The Palestinians refer to this as the al-Nakba. Again, I'll write it up here in case you can't read that. The Nakba, which means the catastrophe. And during this period, over the next year, 750,000 Palestinian refugees are created. Some flee out of fear from their homes. Some leave to avoid the violence. Others are physically and forcibly removed. To back up here, right after the United Nations vote, because there's an element to which a lot of the way this story gets told is that Israel declares its independence, the Arab nations try to wipe it off the map, and the Palestinians were the unfortunate refugees of a war that the Arabs started. But it's missing some details, this story, because in the months leading up to Israel's declaration of independence, in the months leading up to the first Arab soldiers coming in and attacking Israel, Israel had already, well, it's not Israel yet, the Zionist paramilitaries had already begun clearing out of the Arab populations, primarily from these areas and from parts of Jerusalem. And so March 30th, they began their coastal clearings of making sure that there were no Arabs, there's no a strong Arab presence in the areas next to the sea. And between March 30th and May 15th, right? So between March 30th and the day that the first Arab soldier arrives in Palestine, 200 Palestinian villages had already been cleared, and approximately 200,000 people had already been displaced. So this is what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. You have to know, just as you have to know about the Holocaust to make sense of this, you have to know about the Nakba to make sense of the conflict as well. These are the catastrophes for both people. That catastrophe, there's now a second Nakba happening, Palestinians would say. Currently, there have been more people displaced now in Gaza than were displaced in the Nakba of 48. At the end of that war, you can see the partition plan of the UN. Blue is what the Jewish state had. By the end of that war, everything in purple Israel had conquered during the war. The Geneva Conventions have not been written yet. It is not yet international law that you can't take land during a war. So sort of fair game, Israel thinks. They've conquered the land. They went to war. They've taken it. And so this has become part of Israel. But it was not part of the original partition. This is land that was taken during the 1948-1949 war. At the end of that war, Israel has everything in blue and purple. Jordan is in control of the West Bank here, and Egypt is in control of Gaza here. During this period, the part of the Nakba is that approximately 500 Palestinian villages were depopulated. You can see every dot there represents a Palestinian Arab village or town that was depopulated during this war, during this catastrophe. Many of these dots represent places where there's still ruins. Some of them are places that were razed to the ground and they've grown forests. Other places, Israeli cities and towns are built over them. But this is what Palestinians would refer to as the dispossession and the exile that they experienced during that period, as Israel is becoming what was a great achievement in many ways for Israel was an enormous loss in many ways for Palestinians. Immediately after this war, the UN issues a new resolution, 194, that says the Palestinian refugees that want to come back and live at peace should be allowed to return as soon as possible. This is where the language of the right of return of refugees. Remember, this is one of the final status issues, the 5 final status issues that we talked about. That there's a desire, a passionate claim for Palestinians that all the refugees should have the right to return. This is when that begins. This has not yet happened. This resolution. This is where the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, comes into existence. We're jumping ahead in the story. There are lots of things that happened in the 50s. There's a war with Egypt, the Suez, various things that happened, but I've got to skip over it in order to move through the rest of the conversation. The PLO enters, the Palestine Liberation Organization. They write something called the Palestine National Charter. This says a few things that are important. One, they say Palestine should never have been divided, that all of Palestine should belong to Palestinians. It gave a clear definition of what Palestinians are, Arabs that lived in Palestine before 1947. It also said that Jews are most welcome to live in the land if they are peaceful and loyal to an Arab-Palestinian state. And it articulated what it believes Zionism is. Zionism is a colonialist movement in its inception, aggressive and expansionist in its goals, racist and segregationist in its configurations, and fascist in its means and aims. So very clear perspective coming in from the PLO at this time and trying to provide a unified Palestinian voice. And it says also the people of Palestine believe in peaceful coexistence on the basis of legal existence, for there can be no coexistence with aggression, nor can there be peace with occupation and colonialism. So this is the language that's coming in 1964. 3 years later, there is a war called the Six-Day War. Some of you may remember this. Israel launches a preemptive strike, believing that they are about to be invaded by some of their Arab neighbors. They launch a preemptive strike that in one day destroys the air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon. And over the course of 6 days, defeat these armies. What is significant in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that during the 6-day war, Israel conquers more land. And so they come out of the 6-day war now also having control of the West Bank and Gaza. They also get the Sinai, but they end up giving this back to Egypt. And they also conquered the Golan Heights up here from Syria, which they have not given back. Israel has annexed that. It's part of the state. But the West Bank is taken from Jordan at this time, and Gaza is taken from Egypt. So this is when you hear people talking about the occupation of Palestine, this is more or less, some people would say it started in 48, but this is more or less what they're referring to, is when Israel took the West Bank and Gaza in the 6-day war, and they have not given it back, that they still have military control over Gaza and the West Bank to varying degrees. And so what you'll hear when people talk about a two-state solution, you'll sometimes hear it called the Green Line border or the 67 borders. This means that there should be a two-state setup based on what the borders were before the 1967 war. So that there should be a West Bank part of a Palestinian state and Gaza as part of a Palestinian state. That Israel should exist within the borders it had before it conquered land in the 6-day war. So that's what we mean by the 1967 borders, and that's what we mean by the occupation, is beginning at this point, the control Israel takes of the West Bank and Gaza. The prime minister at the time says that they're going to have to devote some thought to the question of how we're going to live in this land without giving up what we've conquered. We've taken this land, we want to be able to keep it. It's part of the expansion into the whole of the biblical promised land. How shall we keep it? And so what they develop is a system of settlements. Settlements refer to any Israeli, a Jewish town or city that is built in land that was conquered in the 6-day war. So there's no such thing in the terms of the terminology of this place as a Palestinian settlement, and there are no such things as settlements within Israel. Those are just called cities. But if there is an Israeli city or town inside the West Bank or inside Gaza, that is considered a settlement. And because it is occupied territory and it is not part of the Israeli state, Israel has never claimed that it's part of their state, but they militarily control it, these settlements are considered illegal. It is against international law to move parts of your population as an occupier into the land that you occupy. And so settlements, excuse me, are another major issue, final status issue, because what has happened, well, I actually have some pictures for you. I forgot I had these. This is how they begin. Some trailers are moved into the West Bank. There are no settlements in Gaza now. There were, but they ended in 2005. They move, Israel will move these kind of trailers into hillsides. Those trailers turn into these kind of more makeshift style houses, which turn into larger cities. And so here's a map. Here's a picture that shows a hill outside of Bethlehem in the West Bank that was kind of the golden bird watching place in all of Palestine, this hill. And then Israel built a settlement there called Har Homa that is now a big city, mayors, schools, universities, these places. And so this is what settlements look like. The current reality is that there are approximately 700,000 Israeli citizens that live in the East Jerusalem, part of East Jerusalem that was conquered during the 6-day war, and in the West Bank. And so many people will say that this reality is why a two-state solution is not possible. The idea that there can be a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state, many will say that dream is gone, because there are now too many Israelis that live in Palestinian land that will never agree to leave. And how are you going to forcibly remove, how would Israel forcibly remove 700,000 of its own people from the West Bank? So this is an enormous obstacle in the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What do we do with the settlements? At the very same time, that Israel is building its settlements in the West Bank, it also begins a practice of destroying Palestinian homes. According to the UN, from 1967, June of 67 to 1971, Israel destroyed approximately 16,000 Palestinian homes. And so the grievances for Palestinians are continuing to increase. Not only are you seeing your hillsides being populated with Israeli towns, Palestinians would call them colonies, but you're also many of your homes being destroyed by the Israeli military. One example of this is, if you've ever been to Israel, you have been to Jerusalem and you have seen this. This is the Western Wall Plaza, the holiest site in Judaism. And it's a big, beautiful plaza that exists now. But before 1967, when Israel took it, there were lots of Arab houses right down here. So all of these homes the people were removed and they were bulldozed in order to make room for this plaza, just as an example of what I'm talking about here. The PLO updates its charter. They had an original charter that seemed measured. They have an updated charter now. In July of 1968, they say Palestine is an indivisible unit. It should never have been divided, and we're never going to give it up. The partition of Palestine by the British was entirely illegal. Israel is therefore entirely illegal, and it was done against our will. It is our national duty to bring up Palestinians in an Arab revolutionary manner. And here's the kicker. Armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine. Thus, it is the overall strategy. So here it is in 1968. The PLO has seen what has happened in 48. They've now seen what has happened with the occupying of land in 1967, and they update their charter to say armed struggle is the way to go. Everyone get behind it. We have a mission. And so the language I often use is that during this period, the Palestinian aim is to undo 1948. They want to undo the fact that Israel exists, which isn't the same, to note, it isn't the same as saying they want to kill all the Jewish people in Israel. I'm sure there were Palestinians that wanted to do that, but that's not what it is saying here. What it is saying is all of Palestine should be united, and that Israel as a Jewish state should not exist. So we're going to abolish the Jewish state, and we're going to do that through violence. And it says that the liberation of Palestine will destroy the Zionist and the imperialist presence. What happens next is, after the PLO says this is when Palestinian terrorism, as we would call it, rises. 1968 to 1974 is a big period of Palestinian terrorism. This is where the Munich kidnapping and killings happened, the Munich Olympics. This is when plane hijackings begin, when bombings begin. All this happens after the PLO says armed struggle is the way to go, and the sort of the Palestinian people, in terms of the resistance, comes behind that goal. You also have things like the Yom Kippur War, which is when Israel was surprise attacked by Arab neighbors and almost lost. It's the only war that Israel really came close to losing. And what's significant about that today is that Hamas's attack on Israel was launched on the 50th, their surprise attack on Israel was launched on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, the last time Israel had a surprise attack. So it was a very particular date that they chose. It wasn't random. Jimmy Carter brokers the Camp David Accords. Israel makes peace with Egypt. Israel also invades Lebanon and attacks the PLO in a 1982 war. So things are escalating, getting much worse over this period. And it gets us up to what is called the First Intifada. Intifada is an Arabic word that means shaking off, and it refers to a massive uprising of Palestinians against the Israeli occupation. There have been two given this name. One is here. Whoa, why are there balloons coming up? That was very strange. There are two. One is here, and the other starts in 2000, which we'll get to in a second. The First Intifada is not necessarily nonviolent, but it is primarily unarmed. The focus of the First Intifada is through civil. There's a call that goes out from the leadership that says we're going to go on strike and working in Israeli cities. We're going to stop paying taxes and fines. We're going to boycott Israeli goods. So it was an attempt to essentially knock the economic legs out of Israel and force them to the table, which more or less was effective because the Oslo Accords come out of this, which were a disaster and failed, but we'll get to that in a second. And this is a significant moment as well, because a really important turning point happens in the First Intifada. The First Intifada launches in December of '87. 1 year later, the Palestinian National Council agrees to some very significant things in the story. They agree to recognize Israel's existence, which is different than saying they believe Israel has the right to exist. They simply recognize that Israel exists and therefore that they can do negotiations with them. They accept all the UN resolutions that had been put forward. And here's the big one. They agree to give up their claim to all of the land. So what they do is essentially say, until now, we have been trying to take all of this land back to return, to make Palestine an indivisible, cohesive, unified Arab state. What they're now saying in 1988, 40 years after trying this and realizing it's not going to work, they say, we'll take a state in the West Bank and in Gaza, which is approximately 22% of the land. So it's a huge strategy shift. What they had been saying since 68 is armed struggle is the only way to do this. We're going to liberate the whole place. Now in 1988, they're saying that's not going to work. We're going to give up our claim to most of the land and we'll take a state in the West Bank and Gaza. And so they proclaim the establishment of the state of Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital. This is where Hamas comes into the picture. Hamas, what it literally means the Islamic Resistance Movement. It's an acronym. And at the time, right before the 1988, when it comes into the kind of the public, the world scene, it was simply a small group offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza. And it was very popular with the people because it had really strong charitable services. It was building hospitals, orphanages, places of worship. It was providing social services to the people. So in that sense, it was well liked by many of the Palestinian people because of the good works that it was doing. But it emerges as a political party in 1988 as a challenge to the PLO that is now saying, we're going to give up claim to most of the land. We're going to begin negotiations with Israel. And Hamas is saying, absolutely not. The armed struggle is not over. We still want the whole of the land. And so now you're getting this split in Palestinian leadership from the PLO, and now Hamas is emerging saying, you're going that way, we're not going that way. We're not ready to negotiate with Israel. We're still on the path of armed struggle to liberate all of Palestine. It's also interesting because Israel at this time begins providing some funding and support to Hamas because it was thinking that a religious injection into the Palestinian resistance would weaken the PLO. So they're taking a divide and conquer strategy. Let's try to prop up Hamas in order to weaken the power of the PLO. I don't think Israel realized exactly what was going to happen by that. But I say this to say that sometimes you'll hear, especially on sort of the extreme pro-Palestinian camp, Israel created Hamas. This is not true. But Hamas was able to grow significantly because of Israeli support. But the creation of Hamas is not an Israeli creation, but it does give it fuel. And Hamas gained significant popularity during the Intifada. Hamas also releases their charter then in August of '88, basically saying, it says many things. A few highlights are Palestine must be Islamic and no one can renounce it or any part of it. Hamas regards nationalism as essential to religious faith, and nationalism, nothing is loftier or deeper than waging jihad against the enemy and confronting him when he sets foot on the land of the Muslims. It is a truth not to be questioned, and that renouncing any part of Palestine means renouncing part of the religion. So Hamas is absolutely a proclaimed Islamic movement whose vision for Palestine is not only liberation, but also the establishment of an Islamic dominant society within the land. Some will say that Hamas charter makes explicit their desire to eradicate Jews. I have read the Hamas charter. I have not seen, but different, I can't read it in the original language. And so different translations say different things. Some use the language of Zionists, others use the language of Jews. I don't know what the original text actually says. The Oslo Accords happen. Bill Clinton brokers a deal. Sort of, he takes credit for the deal, I should say it that way, between Yasser Arafat, who's the chairman of the PLO, and between Yitzhak Rabin, who's the prime minister of Israel. And it is not actually a peace agreement. It is a declaration of principles of a future peace agreement. And so one of the things that they decide is that Palestinians should begin to acquire various degrees of autonomy, starting first with some autonomy in this Palestinian city of Jericho, and also in the Gaza Strip. Their intentions are within 9 months, there will be elections for an interim Palestinian government called the Palestine Authority. Within 2 years, they will begin negotiations on the final status issues. and within 5 years, they aim to have them completed. So the Oslo Accords is not a peace agreement. It does not solve the problem. It declares their intention to solve the problem. It is met with a lot of opposition, especially on the extreme sides. In general, Israeli public is favorable to it. Palestinians are generally skeptical. They're skeptical because they're agreeing to end their intifada and renounce most of the land and not getting a guarantee of statehood, not getting an end to settlements, not getting a commitment to improve human rights or resolve the refugee issue or solve the status of Jerusalem. So they're saying we're giving up this, what seems to be an effective struggle for what exactly? And so there's also now an increasing disillusionment for many Palestinians with the PLO and with the newly established interim PA government. Another significant thing that happens here is the West Bank gets divided into 3 different parts, areas A, B, and C. And this is where we start. If you ever hear comments about the fragmentation of the West Bank, this is what it's referring to. What the Oslo Accords do is that they designate different pieces of land within the West Bank as areas A, B, and C. Area A is land that is more or less fully in Palestinian control within the context of an occupation, though. And those are the major cities. So what you see in the tan would be areas A. You're talking about cities of Jenin, Tulkarem, Nablus, Ramallah, Jericho, Bethlehem, and Hebron, and Qalqilia. So these are areas where Palestinians are meant to have civil and security control, not military control. Palestine has no military, but security and civil control. Area B is Palestinian civil control and Israeli security control. And those are the areas that you see in kind of pink. So this is where Palestinians are meant to have some degree of self-governance, but Israel is responsible for all security in that area. And what you see is in white, area C is essentially all Israeli controlled, civil and security control. Now, hopefully what you're noticing is that even in this declaration of principles for a peace accord, are coming away with even less than they had dreamed of yet again. They've just given up claim to 78% of the land, and now they're coming away with the majority of the West Bank remaining under Israeli control. This is what happens with areas A, B, and C. Tensions continue to rise. There's enormous amount. The settlement population increases. 60,000 more settlers move into the West Bank during the peace years. Suicide bombings begin to take place by Hamas. April of '94, the first suicide bombings. The prime minister, the one that brokered the declaration of principles with Arafat, is assassinated, not by a Palestinian settler, by an Israeli settler who disagreed with the plan. The next prime minister, Shimon Peres, orders the assassination of a Hamas leader that had masterminded some of the suicide attacks. 6 suicide bombings follow in retaliation, and the spiral of vengeance and violence begins to escalate. And it leads us to the Second Intifada, which was the kind of most violent period of the conflict until now, and I'll talk about that soon. This lasts from about September 2000 until September 2005, and it is where the height of the suicide bombing campaign takes place. So again, it's 2000 to 2005. You can look right here in bold that at the height of the Second Intifada, the amount of suicide bombings in Israel reached a height of about 47, which I don't know about you, but imagining someone blowing themselves up 47 times, that's almost once a week in that year, would be absolutely terrifying. And it fuels, again, this sense of anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab sentiment, because as an Israeli, an Israeli Jew, you're looking around thinking, which Palestinian is about to blow themselves up next? Because you could never tell. So there's genuine terror and a exponentially increased fear between Palestinians and Israelis at this time. What happens during that period is that Israel begins to build a barrier between itself and the West Bank, ostensibly to decrease suicide bombing. So this barrier begins to be built in 2002. Which is at the height of the suicide bombing. It says it is for security, but here's the complication that happens as it builds it. If you'll take a look, the black line or the red line here is the 67 borders, the borders between Israel and the West Bank. What you're going to see on the next slide in blue is the actual path of the barrier that they build. And so again, just to kind of follow in red, here's the border out here. Here's the border out here. Here's the border out here, right here. Here's the border. So this wall that Israel builds at the height of suicide bombing for security, 85% of this wall is Palestinian land. And part of what it's doing is it is bringing a large number of the settlements that are in the West Bank onto the Israeli side. So Israel would say it's providing security for the settlements. Palestinians would say the barrier is a land grab. It is both a fence, electrified razor wire, similar to what U.S. prisons have, and it is a wall in places. This is me at 18. You can see some Palestinians put graffiti that says this is not a fence. The wall is about, I think it's 25 feet high. It's 2 or 3 times the size of the Berlin Wall. And it is the path of the wall is approximately 2 times the length of the actual border. That's how much of it goes into the West Bank. Some villages are almost completely surrounded by this wall. The same wall is now built around Gaza, the wall and the fence. And so there's no way out for people of Gaza. They either have to go through the wall and fence into Egypt, or go into Israel, or go through the sea. But Israel has control of the sea as well. So they're surrounded in Gaza by the sea and by this barrier, which is why it has been referred to as the world's largest open-air prison. This is a quick map that can show the interaction, show the level of fragmentation and control in the West Bank. So let me see if I can move my face real quick. There we go. So you see areas A, B, and C are going to pop up on the map here. So what you see in tan is what's under Palestinian civil control. What's in white is under full Israeli control. Then we have the settlements, approximately at the time of this map, 150 settlements populated throughout the West Bank. You can see how deeply they even go. This is the country of Jordan over here. So they go all the way into the border of Jordan. These are Israeli military closed areas, are called fire zones, where Palestinians are not permitted to build any homes because Israel has declared them as closed military areas. These are nature preserves that show places Israel has designated as nature preserves and therefore nature reserves, and therefore Palestinians cannot build homes in those territories. Here's the path of the West Bank barrier that I discussed, with the red being land that has now been pulled back onto the Israeli side of the wall. Here is restricted roads. Israel began to build in the late 90s roads throughout the West Bank that are only allowed for Jewish citizens of Israel. Palestinians are not permitted to use these roads. They're Israeli only. They also begin to establish permanent checkpoints and closures that Palestinians have to pass through if they're going on these roads. So Israel has security checkpoints all throughout the West Bank. And you can let me get to this part. Yeah. So here's the overall fragmentation of the West Bank. The result of Israel has done since the Oslo Accords. And so Palestinians, this has been the challenge. Sometimes people ask, well, why haven't the Palestinians been able to develop a state yet? And this is partly why, because there is an archipelago essentially of territory that makes it nearly impossible for them to build any kind of unified state, much less the fact that they're separated from Gaza. So these are some of the complications. I'm aware of time. I'm going to keep going until I finish this. And I forgot to tell you at the beginning, when you need to drop off, please feel free to do so. This is being recorded, and I will send a link out to everyone afterwards. But I am going to aim, I will stay on for a maximum of 30 minutes beyond the allotted time to continue to answer questions. Again, drop off whenever you need to, but as long as there are people on, I'll go at least for 30 more minutes after the allotted time. There's the issue of water, another final status issue. The issue of water, the primary issue is that most of the water in the region lies in the West Bank. There are major basins and aquifers that are in the West Bank, but even though most of the water, in terms of sovereignty, should be in Palestinian hands, Israel controls much of the water. And so this is part of the conflict, is who actually gets control of the resources. In a two-state solution, if there is sovereignty for Palestinians over the West Bank and Gaza, the question is, how does Israel survive if it doesn't have access to that water? So this is a big issue for Israel. There's also the issue of Jerusalem. The old city of Jerusalem is a holy place for the world's largest monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And these holy sites are packed really close together. So the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque here are among the three most holy sites for Islam, along with Mecca and Medina. The Western Wall here is considered the holiest site for Jews, and those you could literally, no pun intended, throw a rock from the Western Wall onto this Temple Mount Al-Aqsa complex. And then the most holy site for many Christians is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is about right here, which is where tradition says Jesus was crucified and resurrected. And you can walk, if there are no people and there was a straight road, you could walk from here to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in about 10 minutes. So it's an incredibly small piece of land that is holy to these huge widespread religions. And there are basically three major proposals for for Jerusalem. Israelis claim Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel. And in fact, they passed a law, I think it's in 1980, that says that Jerusalem has to forever remain the capital of Israel. It cannot be divided. Palestinians in 1988 claimed that East Jerusalem was their capital. And the old city, by the way, would be in East Jerusalem. So that's a contested space, obviously. And many of the proposals from the British partition to the UN partition to other international peace plans have proposed that Jerusalem be some kind of entity in and of itself. It's called corpus separatum, which means a separate body. And so that Jerusalem would be controlled by everyone and no one. There are various proposals about how that looks, but there's a recognition that there's something unique about Jerusalem and it must be treated in a unique way. So these are the five major final status issues. What do we do about all the Palestinian refugees? Do they have the right to return? What do we do about all the settlements, the 700,000 settlers, Israeli citizens that live in Palestinian land? What do we do about Jerusalem? How does it get divided? What do we do about water? And what are the borders? Are we going to do a one-state solution where everyone lives in the same land? Is it a two-state solution where there's a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state? So these are the issues that often are being worked out. So as I say, let me go over real quick what the different proposals are. This is deeply reductionist, what I'm about to tell you. So the one-state solution, more or less, is that what you see in green, white, and gray all becomes one single state. Israelis and Palestinians live in the same country and presumably would have equal rights, voting rights. It would be, we hope, a democracy. So that's the proposal for a one-state. The complication for Israel specifically with a one-state is that currently Palestinians remember, there are 20% of Israel's population are Palestinians, and then you have also the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinian population of this whole area currently outnumber the Jewish population of the whole area, not by much, but there is a larger Palestinian population, and the birth rate is also higher. Israel calls this the demographic problem, because if they were to incorporate all of the Palestinians into Israel and make them citizens and have the right to vote, well, it is very unlikely that a majority population that is not Jewish would vote to keep living in a Jewish state. So the identity of Israel as a Jewish state could likely, or very possibly, cease to exist. Again, not that the Jews would be killed, but that Israel as a Jewish state would no longer exist because you would have a majority population in the Jewish state that are not Jews and that wouldn't vote to live there. And this has brought up for Israel a conundrum. Let me see if I can flip over. I've seen it expressed this way, that Israel has three things that it says it wants. They want to be Jewish, they want to have all the land, and they want to be a democracy. And the idea is that Israel, the quagmire Israel has created for itself, is that it can only ever have two of these. It can be Jewish and have all of the land, but then it can't be a democracy if it wants to remain a Jewish ethno-state, because the majority of the population wouldn't be Jewish. It can have all of the land and be a democracy, but then it can't stay Jewish because the majority of the people wouldn't be Jewish. Or it can be Jewish and be a democracy, but then it can't have all the land. And so this is the issue: is there's an attempt to have all three of these, but the idea is it can only ever have two of them. Let's see if I can get back. Whoop, that's not the way I want to go. There we go. So that's the issue with the one-state solution, one of the major issues. The two-state solution would be that Palestine becomes a sovereign state in green alongside an Israeli state. And then you have issues here around what do we do with the settlements? Are 700,000 Israeli citizens going to agree to live in a Palestinian state? What do we do about water? Where are the borders exactly? So there's issues with the two-state solution there. It's not even a viable option, that it died with the Oslo Accords. Then the question of the status quo. Do we just continue the status quo? Does Israel maintain its occupation indefinitely? It's been 60 years. Do they keep that going as long as possible? Many would say that what Hamas did recently was an attempt to disrupt the status quo, to say, whatever happens, what is happening now can't continue. Something has to change, and there is a massive attack to disrupt the status quo. Or is there something else that's going to happen? Some have proposed a confederacy. It's called like a shared homeland with open borders, various things. I won't get into all that now, but these are the major things you hear about: one state, or status quo. So I'm now going to just jump into quickly Gaza and Hamas right now, and then I'm going to turn to your questions. So as it relates to Gaza and Hamas, Israel had built settlements after 1967 in Gaza, but it removed all of them in 2005, deciding that it didn't want to hold on to Gaza in terms of having an Israeli presence there. There are then elections that take place the next Palestine-wide elections, and Hamas actually wins the majority of the Palestinian parliament at that time and was elected into power on kind of three major platforms. One is the PA has failed us. The Palestinian Authority has failed us. They have not succeeded in getting us our state. They have capitulated with Israel. They are a puppet of Israel. They are weak. We cannot follow them anymore. That path is gone. Second is we must continue to resist the Zionist colonization and occupation. We are not going to negotiate with Israel. We're going to continue fighting and resisting the occupation. And the other is more or less to the Palestinian people, we've got your back. We've got social services. We're going to continue to take care of you. And so these are the kind of the three big ideas of the Hamas campaign, which are effective, and they win the vote. Over the next year, the PA in the West Bank and Gaza, and Hamas try to form a unity government, but it falls apart. And they're not able to do that. And then because Hamas had already been designated by the US and by Israel and many other countries as a terrorist organization because of its suicide bombing in the 90s and 2000s, once the unity government doesn't happen and the PA maintains control of West Bank and Hamas takes control of Gaza, Israel then enforces a blockade and a siege of Gaza. They wall it off. They take control of the sea. And they begin controlling everything in and out of Gaza, given that the government of Gaza is now a designated terrorist organization. Over the years that follow, there are an enormous amount of conflicts between Hamas and Israel, which results in a lot of death, primarily on the Palestinian side. What you see here on the bottom layer are the number of deaths for Israelis during these large offensives. And what you see on the top are the number of Palestinian deaths at the same time. And so you can see of the killing in the kind of wars between Israel and Hamas, 79% of the deaths are Palestinian. So there's been a significant imbalance in the number of people that have died, which changed significantly in the first week of what's happening now. Now there have been so many more Palestinians killed; it's beginning to become unbalanced again. But this is the tension that is rising, and for the people of Gaza is that they have no way out. They're living again 25 miles by 7 miles, regularly bombed by Israel when Hamas is sending rockets out as well. And there's nowhere for them to go. Egypt won't let them leave through the Egypt border, and Israel won't let them enter Israel, and they can't leave by the sea. And so they literally are just sort of, as they call it, fish in a barrel. There's no way to get out. Hamas also updates its charter. It's been a while, so they take another swing at it. Here are some things that they say. The Islamic Resistance Movement is a Palestinian Islamic national liberation and resistance movement. Its goal is to liberate Palestine and confront the Zionist project. It says, again, the Zionist project is racist, aggressive, colonial, and expansionist, and is hostile to the Palestinian people. And it says something interesting here. Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. Yet it is the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and Jews with their own colonial project and illegal entity. And Hamas has been, I don't know what people they're saying kind of in back channels, but in terms of public statements from Hamas, they have maintained fairly consistently that their violence and their resistance is targeting an occupation, not targeting Jewish people because they're Jewish. You're welcome, of course, to discount that, but it is their public position. And they also, again, say there shall be no recognition of the legitimacy of the Zionist entity. And then finally, there's a change in tone here. Hamas now says, what they said before was all of this land should be united under Palestine. And they still emphasize that again. No part of the land of Palestine shall be compromised or conceded. However, as a temporary measure, they say, we will take a state, we support a state within the 1967 borders, the return of the refugees, as well as part of that. And so whether some say Hamas never intends to follow through with basically the two-state proposal, and that they really do intend to take all of the land. Others say that Hamas has come to realize they will never have all the land. They are actually okay with the two-state solution, but they still have to give lip service to the idea of taking back all of Palestine. I don't know what the truth is. Things got so bad in Gaza that the UN in 2013 said that it will become uninhabitable or may be uninhabitable by 2020 based on current trends. That was before what is happening now. That was the projection of the UN at that time, where I think approximately 90% of the water in Gaza is undrinkable. Israel is in full control of the electricity, the water, the food, and the fuel. And as you saw, I'm sure in the news, when the siege of Gaza was announced about 10 days ago, they announced that they would be cutting off all of those things to Gaza because they have the power to do that. They control everything that goes in and out of Gaza. So where is Gaza in 2023? It had 2.2 million people at the beginning of the year. 46% of them are unemployed. It's among the highest unemployment rate in the entire world. Electricity, gas, water, food, movement, all controlled by Israel. And half the population of Gaza are children under the age of 18. And here's something to note. This current military campaign that Israel is doing in Gaza is the 5th in 15 years. Half of the 2.2 million people are under the age of 18. Which means half of the population has experienced 5 now bombing campaigns in their short 18-year life, right? Or less than that. The amount of trauma that is hitting Gaza is extreme. Coming up to the current day, on October the 7th, Hamas launched a murderous assault on primarily southern Israel, and killed, they didn't kill 1,400 people that day, but also people who have succumbed to their wounds since. 1,400 Israelis have been killed, 3,400 have been wounded, and 200 have been taken hostage. As I said before, it is the single deadliest day for Israel and its 75-year history, which is saying something given all the things that we just talked about. Single deadliest day. And for Jewish people, it is considered the single deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. More Jews died in one day than had died since the Nazis. And so this is an enormously significant and traumatic time for Israel. For Palestinians, 4,000, that's the estimate I saw right before I got on the call, 4,000 Palestinians have been killed. 1,100 of them are kids, which means in an 11-day bombing campaign, 100 kids have died every day. 12,500 have been wounded, and 1 million plus have been displaced. So half the population of Gaza has now been displaced. What I realized recently is that during the Second Intifada, approximately 1,000 Israelis died and approximately 3,000 Palestinians died. In what was the bloodiest period of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over 5 years, in 11 days, the killing has surpassed that 5-year period. That's how the scale of this is beyond anything. Many are saying it is the worst period in the entire history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it is by far the deadliest. And so that's what we're facing currently in the news. Okay, that was a lot. My voice is hoarse. I'm sure that felt like you were drinking from a fire hydrant. This is often the case. And again, this was a very reductionist history. There's so much more nuance to the story, but I think these are the key points along the way that are worth knowing. So again, I know we're at 90 minutes. If you got to drop, please drop. I'm going to hang around for another 30 and take your questions. My dad has been keeping up with these questions, and I'm going to bring him into the spotlight, and he will throw questions to me that I will try to respond to.
Michael, I've been trying to address a few of them as we've gone along, the simple, straightforward ones. I'll start with the most recent question from Thea Bissell. Forgive me if I don't have your name correct. How is Hamas getting their weapons, and who are their allies, like the U.S. and Israel's relationship?
Yeah, well, this is one of those where I was like, actually, Dad, you would probably have a better answer than me. Again, your familiarity with Gaza is much more than mine. So if you have a response to that, please go
ahead. Yeah, currently what is happening in Gaza, as I understand it, is that the Hamas is now able to build their own weapons. For most of their history, the weapons were smuggled in, and they still are to a certain extent. But they've also been able to bring in the parts necessary to create factories to manufacture missiles within Gaza. It's almost impossible to conceive that they could smuggle in 6,000 to 7,000 rockets. Their primary ally in terms of funding and support is Iran. Iran supports Hezbollah in the north and also offers support to Hamas. So I think that's the simple answer as best I can give it.
Thank you. And we will be giving rapid fire answers to get into as much content as possible.
Another question is why Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank?
Hopefully that's asked and answered. I just covered that right there at the end.
Good.
So I won't spend any more time.
Are there similarities? Are there similarities from Child None? Are there similarities in what is happening to the fate of the first peoples of the United States?
For sure. Given the fact that you've asked that question means that you see the similarities. There are fascinating maps, I didn't put them in this, that show the loss of Palestinian land since 1948, juxtaposed with the loss of Native American land since the colonizers from Europe came. And so, yes, the dispossession and the displacement of those first peoples, there's deep resonance, for sure.
Another Chow Nun asked, in what ways are Netanyahu's politics, the politics of the right in Israel, affecting the current fighting? How did they lay the groundwork for what's happening now?
Yeah, Netanyahu has been the longest serving prime minister. Let me also say this. For a lot of these questions, the stuff that I just presented to you, most of the history, I'm well researched on it. I've taught it a lot. I'm very familiar with it. Some of the questions around current events and current politics are not part of my level of expertise. So there may be some of this where I just offer my opinion or what I have picked up, but it's not necessarily deeply well researched. So I just want to offer that disclaimer. Netanyahu is the longest serving prime minister in Israel and has had some of the most extreme policies of continued occupation of Palestine. I would say that for Israeli security as well, he has been a detriment for the Israeli people. That his increasing restrictive and oppressive policies within the West Bank have fuel the desperation of Palestinians, which fuels increased violence. And just the idea that this horrific bombing campaign of Gaza will provide security for Israel, to me, is misguided. You're giving not only Palestinians, but much of the world reason to be deeply angry, and for many hatred of Israel. And so I don't think Netanyahu is actually bringing about any security for Israeli people in what he's doing. There's a lot more to say, but I'll pause there.
Some of these questions, I think, some of these questions I think are difficult to address in this setting. Two have to do with where to give humanitarian aid and also relatively unbiased resources, books and news sources. And I think you're going to share a reading list. Is that correct?
So tomorrow I will send an email to everyone who is registered for the call, whether you were on the call or not, that is going to list organizations that I suggest you donate to, both in terms of immediate humanitarian aid and in terms both in Gaza and in Israel for the families that are traumatized there as well as organizations to support that have been doing and will continue to do the ongoing work of peace building and conflict resolution and social services. And I have a Amazon recommended resources list that you'll be able to click, and it'll take you to Amazon, where you'll see all the resources together with my descriptions of what each one is about. So all that's coming to you tomorrow.
Kimmy Abernathy asked, what do we know about the desire for peace among the Israelis? And I think you've addressed this somewhat. The subsection of Palestinians that don't want peace, the subsection of Israelis that don't. What about the overall population?
Again, I am not an expert on this, so this is my perception. Before all the news turned to the massacre by Hamas and the news and the massacres in Gaza, Israeli news was about the civil unrest in Israel between the growing polarity within Israeli society of people who are fed up with the status quo, who are fed up with fascist governments, who are fed up with the occupation. And so there is a growing movement. There has always existed and will always exist, and it is growing, a movement of Israelis who want Netanyahu gone, who want to have peace with Palestinians, who know that that is the best way to guarantee their safety and security. That there are many Israelis who know that there is no security for Israel without the security for Palestinians, that it has to be mutually guaranteed. As long as Palestinians are oppressed and occupied, Israel will not be secure. And so that they have to go together. There's a really wonderful group called Standing Together. I highly recommend that you check them out. I'll drop that in the chat. Standing Together. Let's see if I can drop it in the chat, can I? Yes. That I encourage you to check out in terms of Israeli movements. Yeah, I have no idea what the percentage is of these things, but it is there. Yeah.
Quick overview of the history behind the alliance of so-called Western countries with Israel. Is it primarily strategic from a military political standpoint? How much of it is faith-based, cultural?
I mean, my goodness, that's there's so many layers to that. Obviously you saw in the history that when the Zionist movement felt like Britain had betrayed them, they turned their attention to the U.S. And so the alliance with the U.S. goes back into the 40s. I think there are lots of reasons. I won't get deep into this. I won't focus on the West in general, just the U.S. that has to do with the guilt over the Holocaust, sending people back, and the desire for Jews to have a safe homeland. There is the effect of the Cold War, where the U.S., while the Cold War was cold for the U.S. and the Soviet Union, it was hot in many other areas of the world as those two powers played out proxy wars, and Israel and Palestine was one of those. So you had Israel funded and supported and supplied by the U.S., and you had Palestinians funded, supported, and supplied by the Soviet Union. So there's some Cold War stuff. There's also a sense of Israel. I've heard Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, which actually isn't true, but also is the front line against the increasing war on terror front. That it's sort of a beacon of hope in the Middle East and the fight against terror. There is also 9/11 also shifted a lot of increased support for Israel. There is also the power of things like the Israeli lobby that has an enormous amount of power in the U.S. politics, which is why there's not a U.S. president that has not supported Israel, because you arguably cannot get elected president if you speak out against Israel. It's one of the only things that Democrats and Republicans both agree on. And there's so many other pieces to it. And then, because the U.S. thinks of itself as a Judeo-Christian country, there is a kind of a religious sympathy and alignment that happens, especially among Christians, who will say that the Jews are the chosen people, that the land was given to them by God, and they have the right to return to that land and have their state. And so there's also this deep religious connection in terms of biblical and religious reasons.
A three-part question. I'll start with the last part that I know you can speak to, and that is, where are the Palestinian refugees? Where have they gone? Perhaps what is the definition of a refugee? Do they really still want to come home?
Yeah, great. So Palestinian refugees are all over. So if you think about a map of, again, if we just think about what just happened, think about a map of Israel. and Palestine. We have the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. Here's the West Bank. Basically, this is not proportional. This is not a proportional map. That many of the Palestinian refugees were refugees from the lands the areas that were inside of Israel, were inside of Israel now, and they became refugees into the West Bank and into Gaza. So, for instance, some of the people today that have been, of the million people that have been displaced in Gaza, for those that were alive in 1948, they were displaced in 1948. They were likely displaced again in 1967, and they've been displaced again, and all within their lifetime. 3 different refugee creations. So there are many refugee camps within Gaza and within the West Bank that were meant to be temporary, but have more or less become permanent. Many Palestinian refugees also go into Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, all over the place. There are many in the United States. They spread out around the world. And so just as we talked about the Jewish diaspora that began in 70 AD, we talk about the Palestinian diaspora, that they are spread across the world. Yeah, hopefully that's sufficient.
Yeah. A tough one, but a personal one, and that is, of the choices that you presented about a resolution to this conflict, which one do you favor?
I don't know. I go back and forth. On the one hand, I see many Palestinians moving away from talking about liberating Palestine and talking about a civil rights movement within Israel, of anticipating there'll be a one-state solution and there should be equality there. And I think there's an argument to be made there, right? Especially if we have values of plurality, democracy, diversity, there's an argument to be made that a one-state solution where Palestinian and Israelis live in one state is ideal. But I also think there will be a civil war if that happens. Two-state, like, I have long been a proponent of the two-state solution because I believe I want Palestinians to have their own sovereign state in the same way that Jewish Israelis have theirs. I don't think it's going to happen. It's my personal opinion, but I'm not done advocating for it. For me, one of the most compelling, it's not without complications, one of the most compelling visions that I have heard is called A Land for All. You can Google this and find information. And the basic proposal is that there would be a sovereign Palestinian state and a sovereign Israeli state within the 1967 borders, approximately, but the borders would be open. And if you're an Israeli, you can live anywhere, including the West Bank, so the settlements can stay, but you will be a Palestinian resident and an Israeli citizen. You can vote in your local town elections, but your national vote goes to the Israeli parliament. You can be you're a Palestinian citizen of the West Bank or Gaza, but you can live in Israel if you want to go back to your ancestral city of Haifa on the sea, or Tel Aviv. You can do that, but you can vote in the local elections there, but not in the national elections. Your national vote goes to Palestine. And it's a way of also, part of what it does is the two-state solution does not take into account that both Israelis and Palestinians have deep roots in the other's land. Many Palestinians were driven out of these coastal areas, and that the right of return is not to the West Bank and Gaza, it's to that place. They want to go back to those homes. And for many Israelis, and especially religious Jews, the heart of the promised land is the West Bank. And so they have deep roots there as well. And so a shared land for all, the Land for All movement, is trying to find a way to speak to those needs. And I'm very compelled by that articulation.
I think we've gone through most of the questions that I can see. The chat box is fairly small, the ones that I think that you can address. Perhaps you might say a word about humanitarian aid and the conflict, I don't say conflict resolution, but the conflict management, the peace and justice movements that you've been involved with.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of humanitarian aid, where I would suggest giving your money is PCRF, which is the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. They have had a long-standing presence in Gaza, providing medical relief. I don't think exclusively to children, but that has been the primary focus. And they're on the ground now and are able to provide incredibly urgent medical care. Doctors Without Borders is also a really great one to give to. The U.S. announced, I just read before I got on, the U.S. announced that it has made a deal with Israel to get humanitarian aid into Gaza. I haven't read any of the details of that. I just saw the headline, so I'm going to be looking at that to see what's going on there. In terms of peace building, reconciliation, nonviolence, these movements within Israel and Palestine, I'm very compelled, as I said, by Standing Together, a movement of young Israelis. Within Palestine, I'm a big supporter of Tahrir, which means change, and it's a national Palestinian nonviolence movement. And I will tell you more about that in the email tomorrow. I'm a big supporter of them. And there's also amazing organizations like the Parents Circle, which is an organization of bereaved Israelis and Palestinians who are working together over their shared sense of loss, saying that we who have paid the highest price possible, we have to talk, and that their goal is to make sure other parents, other families avoid the same pain. One of the leaders of it told me once, he said, I think we're the only organization in the world that does not want new members. We're not looking to grow because we don't want more bereaved people. Now, of course, they've gotten many in the last week, but those are some of the ones that I've really been compelled by, and more will follow in the email.
One question that just came through from Jerry Collins is, how have your family's political positions changed or evolved during your 50+ years in the area? Perhaps that's more of a family question than for this forum. I'll leave that up to you as the host.
I'll just say an enormous amount of the shift happened with my dad. I can let him tell his own story. But I made my first trip to Israel in 2000, and I came back on fire for it. I had this dream. I wanted to study Hebrew. I wanted to put a mezuzah on my door. I was fascinated with Judaism. I was fascinated with Israel. So compelled by it. There was a magic to the place. That was in 2000. Went again in 2001. The next time I went back was 2007. Israel had built the wall. It was my first time to go into the West Bank, to spend any time in Bethlehem, to go to Nablus, to go to Ramallah. And I began to see what was happening to Palestinians, something that I had not seen before. And so it did not dispel my appreciation and love of Judaism, but it began to complicate my deep passion for all things Israel. As I began to see that, oh my goodness, there's a whole thing happening here. And so when my dad had his kind of awakening in 2000, 2001, and began to read lots of more things to hear the Palestinian story, the kind of family began to go on this shift of being what I think most Americans are, which is pro-Israel by default. If an American knows literally nothing and you ask them who they support, their odds are they're going to say Israel. They're just kind of wired in. And so we began to move from that into a position or into an ability to hold both of these stories, whereas before we weren't really holding the truth of the Palestinian suffering, didn't know about the Nakba, and so those things have shifted a lot of our beliefs. There's actually in 1919, Woodrow Wilson commissioned a survey of the Arab public opinion in kind of the Palestinian region. As the commission was called the King Crane Commission, and when the report that the commission wrote, the opening of it said, the committee went over with minds predisposed in favor of Zionism, but the actual facts in Palestine changed our minds. This was in 1919, and I've often felt like that was part of the family story. Our minds were predisposed in favor of what we knew of Zionism, but the actual facts of what we saw in terms of the implementation, in terms of the Palestinian struggle, the Palestinian needs, shifted our uncritical, potentially support of Israel and Zionism. Nor should there be any place in the world that is walled off from critique, and it should not be an issue to call out atrocities when they happen, whether they're by Palestinians, Americans, Israelis, whatever it is. Wrong is wrong. Dad, anything you want to say to that?
No, I think you said it well. It's a long and complicated story, and
for sure.
As you mentioned, for just one quick note, the B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, was a significant part of the transformation that occurred for me. Michael was with me on a trip in February 2000 when I first encountered a publication by this organization, and I remember vividly going to the hotel room that night, reading it 2-3 times, and going downstairs to breakfast the next morning with my parents and say, "Have you ever heard any of this? Could this actually be true? Is this happening?" And so that began a long process of journey into the West Bank, working with colleagues, and as Michael said, opening my eyes to to a reality, another truth.
Yeah. Maybe just a couple more, if there are any. Anything you're seeing?
Yeah. Okay, here, I don't know if you see this one, Michael.
Which one?
After the Romans drove the Hebrews out of Israel around 70 AD, who inhabited Israel during the Roman Empire? When did the Palestinians first move into the land? And what is the ethnic history of the Palestinians? In a few minutes.
Not my expertise. I won't even try to respond to it because I couldn't give an informed answer to that question.
Yeah.
Most of my knowledge of the place is from the late 1800s and beyond, from the start of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't have enough knowledge to answer that on a call with 170 people. So I would say Google that and research it yourself. Yeah,
I think one comment to make in response is that we know families, Palestinian families, who can trace their family lineage back for 700 or 800 years in historic Palestine, who've been there that long. So they see themselves as indigenous people who have existed in the land for hundreds of years. So in that sense, they're very much as a colonization of their land in their experience. And very few of us probably could trace our ancestry back for 600 or 700 or 800 years.
But to my knowledge, when the Jewish diaspora happened, it's not. I've never heard that every Jewish person was driven out of Palestine. So as far as I know, there has also been a consistent Jewish presence in Palestine, and so it is one of the things that makes, I think, this conflict somewhat unique in the world is that there are competing claims of indigeneity. That both peoples would say they are the indigenous people, and they both have arguments to make around it. And so that's a part of the complexity of Palestinians saying, we were here first and you've colonized our land, and Jewish people saying, well, we were here before you and we were driven out, and so we want to come home. And so there are these competing claims to that you have to work out. Anything else to say? Oh, I just saw one thing. Hold on. My uncle Rob, who I teach classes with on Israel-Palestine, knows a lot more about the question that Christy just asked. Rob, I'm going to bring you on, and we are short on time, so just maybe in a couple of minutes, you can respond to this. I got to find you, though. Can you raise your hand, Rob? There's a lot of people on this call. Raise your hand, like virtually, so that I can pop up on the top of my screen. Oh, there you are. Okay, there, I see you now. Okay, great. All right, Rob, go ahead.
The short answer is it's too complicated, but it's a misnomer, as you said, that the Jews were all expelled, but they also didn't fill the land at the time. There was a large Gentile population, non-Jewish population in the land that remained. And so over the centuries, people just continued to move. It's also not accurate to say the Palestinians moved in. There was an Arab presence throughout the region going back into Old Testament times. And so it just continued. There were populations already there and migration that continued to occur. That's a short answer.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob.
Michael, I don't want to call this to a close prematurely, so I'm not saying this should be the last question, but in some of the time that you have left, I think this Sally Mkoa has asked, I think, what is a really important question. That is, what is your call to action? What do you want to happen, or do you want anything to happen after tonight other than for people to be better educated?
It's a great question. The most common thing I get asked is, like, what can we do? And to be bleak, not much. Like, that's my genuine belief. Right now, there is not much. You have the fourth largest military in the world, one of only 8, I think, nuclear powers in the world, backed by the most powerful military in the world, unequivocally, that has dropped at least 7,000 bombs on a people that can't get out. And they're doing it in front of the world, and again, with the full support of the United States. So us as individual people, can we stop that? No, I don't think you can. So what we can do is use our resources to try to support those who are on the ground doing the work. And so that's what I'll send you tomorrow, is who are the people that are doing the work that is needed, both in terms of immediate aid and in terms of that will continue to do the work after the immediate crisis has dissipated, whenever that happens. My invitation to you all is to if this is the beginning of your journey or somewhere in the middle, to continue the path of being informed about this place, a place that affects literally the entire world. The resources are out there. Google is your friend. Learn all that you can. Share the things that you want on social media. The amount of things I'm seeing on social media are often very uninformed, and people are getting on. They're choosing a side. They're being, well. This is the sense of what happens, is that I have to be pro-Israel or I have to be pro-Palestinian. And what my leader of the Tahrir movement in Palestine, Ali Abu Awad, a national nonviolence leader, he consistently says, being pro-Israel or being pro-Palestinian helps no one. What we need is people who are pro-solution and pro-peace. And so that's what I'm interested in, and I hope for you all is that you can come away from this seeing a deeper understanding of the story, and also getting a deeper understanding of the immense passion of loss of belonging that both people feel to that land, and that neither one of them are going away. Palestinians are not going to leave, and Jews are not going to leave. It's not going to happen. They will have to, they will live in the same land forever. And so what can we do to support a solution that allows for both people to live with dignity, to live with respect, to live in mutual security and recognition of each other? I think that's what I'm interested in. This is not in any way a webinar that's encouraging you to be like, oh, look at how bad Israel is, or look at what the terrorists are doing. Like, that's not the point. The point is to give context to it and to orient us to saying the pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian campaigns have led us here to where we are now. 4,000 Palestinians dead, 1,400 Israelis dead, and counting. And so I think there's a need for a shift in the way that we think about support of the place. If you are, if you are a praying person, then pray. If you are if you're a big believer in political advocacy, write to your representatives, elect different people. There are all kinds of things that we can do to take action. But I think what I often have heard from folks is saying, like, what can I do to end the violence now? And the answer to that is there's nothing we can do to that. That's beyond our control. But we can get involved in what comes after this. I think I will end there. We are about at time. My sincere thanks to you all for showing up on this call and sitting with me for nearly 2 hours. I hope this was helpful. I will upload this to YouTube and we'll share the link with you all tomorrow so that you can share it with the people that you like. So again, thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time. And again, move forward with a sense of passion for supporting both the peoples in the land, and how we can all figure out how to share this place that so many of us love, that we have shared religions there, we have deep ties there, because neither people are leaving, and so we've got to find a way to be pro-solution and pro-peace, and not to take either one of the sides, while also recognizing the imbalance of power that exists. Both of these things are true. I'm very interested in how we can all learn how to hold multiple truths at the same time. All right, that's us. Thank you all so much. I see all the comments in the chat, so thank you for that. You're very welcome. Take care, everybody.